This podcast
Welcome
is
to
brought to
another
you by the North
episode
Dakota
of Plain
Petroleum
Talk Live. I'm
Foundation.
your host, Rob Port.
From heating our homes and powering our vehicles to cell phones,
it's not a new
clothing, and
debate.
medical equipment,
Oil
oil and
it's
natural
probably
gas
been
makes
given
everyday life
new
better.
importance in
North
our
Dakota
region.
Oil and Natural Gas,
We had an
advancing the
incident not so long
possibilities.
ago, and it
Learn
didn't
more
happen in
at
North Dakota, but it happened in the Fargo Moorhead
ndpetroleumfoundation.org.
community. It happened in Minnesota. It was some unfortunate soul decided to vandalize a mosque in Moorhead and painted some ugly things and some ugly symbols on the side of that mosque. A suspect in that case has been arrested. That case is proceeding. And it really was, if you want to say that any part of the incident was beautiful, the community's reaction to it was, in that a lot of people, many of them not Muslim, came together to help clean off the graffiti and to get together and to show solidarity and support, and that's all a good thing. But what it has sparked, or maybe what it has given renewed momentum to, is a push for hate crime legislation. Now, the city of Fargo, Fargo City Commissioner Arlette Preston, is considering a city ordinance that would address hate crimes. And then the Forum editorial board, the company that I work for, our editorial, the Fargo Forum, they called for statewide hate crime legislation. So do we need that? Is it something that works? Is it something that we should do? Here to talk to me about that, to talk with us about that, is Wess.
Yeah, so being an activist who's actually worked on both the legislation that was presented in Bismarck and also the local city ordinance as well, I've really got to get a look behind the scenes. So it basically started last year on May 30th with the George Floyd march that happened in, Fargo, and we marched over the West Fargo as well. And so as we were marching back from West Fargo, as you would know, Michael Griffin would strike a protester and carry him for 3 blocks at speeds touching close to 70 miles per hour. He drove around a barricade to do that. And so, at that time, that's where the wheels really got spinning for me as far as looking into, what protections do we have, against acts that are committed in hate against people of color. And, there really wasn't any on the books. And so from there, I kind of really started speaking out as far as needing protections for people of color within the state of North Dakota. And, as I became an advocate truly within the community, started facing death threats myself, multiple times walking outside of my place of residence, confronted directly in front of my residence by people wishing to basically do me harm. And that just really started to drive home the point. There were just so many different scary encounters that I was coming across where, this was based off of hate towards me, and the work that I'm putting in, and beyond that, researching the data to see that North Dakota as a state touched as high as highest in the entire country in 2012 in hate crimes per 100,000 residents. It was clear that something needed to be done about this. And it's not just the fact of the legislation or the being passed in a law and deterring people from committing hateful acts. It's also about the message. That comes along with it in saying that hate will not be tolerated. Hateful acts will not be tolerated as well. I think that was also an important message. So as I began working on this stuff with legislators and our city leaders, I truly saw it as being a possible shield from me and the people who would wish to do me harm, and letting them know in advance that should you act out upon your hate, you are going to be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. So we can get caught in the nitty gritty and the application. We all know that hate crime laws are extremely hard to enforce without being able to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt. But that does not mean that it shouldn't be on the books. It does not mean that people should not know that, we're going to prosecute this to the fullest extent of the law. So I would love to see something passed, not only in the city of Fargo, but across the state of North Dakota.
foremost, I agree. I mean, we've got real issues in this country and even in our communities in North Dakota. Unfortunately, criminalizing bigotry is not going to stop bigotry. In fact, it may propagate or create more bigotry. In fact, hate crimes laws have proven to have paradoxical effects. They actually hurt the people that are intended to be protected by them. And I think, to start with your question, I think there's really two questions. Number one, should we be having this debate? Yes. Where should that debate be taking place? It should be taking place at the North Dakota legislature. Cities like Fargo are not imperials. They're not islands unto themselves. We should not have separate crimes in cities like Fargo that we don't have in cities like West Fargo. Matters like this are matters of statewide concern, and they should be addressed in a statewide proposition with statewide discussion. So my biggest objection to the current proposal, which I've not seen, by the way, I've not seen anything published, is it won't have uniform effect. And then secondly, the second question is, are these things effective? And I think the studies will show across the board that they're not. They have adverse effects. In fact, the leading United States Supreme Court case on the constitutionality of hate crimes was a Black defendant punished for a hate crime against a white victim. So if we're separating out classes of people based on punishing people of color more harshly than we're punishing people who are Caucasian, or providing more protections to people of color versus protections to people who are Caucasian, we're just furthering the divide. And by the way, North Dakota does have a hate crime law on the books. It has been on the books for quite some time. It regulates discrimination in public places, and it protects people of color based on not only race, but religion, sex, national origin, and people who intentionally engage in behavior in public places that is discriminating based on one of those suspect classifications are guilty of an offense under North Dakota law currently.
And let's just add a little asterisk there that even though we have that on the books, it's never actually ever been applied since its existence. Not to mention that it literally fell into a book of dust where, as we've tried to work on passing legislation and hate crime laws, no one even, I sat down with the state's attorney office who didn't actually realize that they even had it on the books until about a month or two ago. So that is the definition of passing performative legislation during the time of the civil rights era, with absolutely zero actual input or energy behind actually enforcing it. So
that would be an enforcement problem, Wes, not necessarily a legislative problem. Like if we have a policy on the books and it's not being enforced, then I think our objective is to get it enforced, not to create new law. Wouldn't you agree?
But I mean, it's not just that it wasn't enforced. It was it was never used and absolutely forgotten about. So this was not even something that people were saying, well, we have it here. Does it apply? Our state's attorney's office didn't even know that this thing was on the books until a month or two ago. And we're talking about something that was passed almost 50 years ago.
Yeah, it was passed in 1973, and I don't know it's accurate to say that it's never been prosecuted, because I think I recall a case in Jamestown where I represented a defendant who was prosecuted under that specific statute. So anecdotal information from a state's attorney or an assistant state's attorney who's been prosecuting for a handful of years isn't the type of proof that I would want to say that we need to develop a new law because the existing laws don't work. And Rob, I agree with you. The issue, if we're having problems with enforcement, if people are being discriminated against and there's a law permitting prosecution for discrimination, the focus needs to be on training prosecutors and training police to enforce the existing law, not creating new crimes.
But the issue is that, as you stated, this is a discrimination law in public places. So if a hate crime is committed on private property, well, what then? What happens then? So there's no protections there. And it also does not include the LGBTQ community as well. So we have a marginalized class that when you talk about black trans women who are facing the highest amount of acts across the country right now, they're not part of that protected class. So that law is outdated. It needs to be updated, and it's not being really applied as well. And it's only specific to public places, so it's not full and complete. It does not provide full protection. And seeing the way our state is currently set up, where it's so Republican dominated, getting something passed seems like something that's almost an impossible task at this point.
Well,
so
it seems like you may have to persuade a lot of Republicans, which they are persuadable on issues.
Come on, Rob. Looking at this past session, man, that was, I'm not gonna, speak on that, but that was very troubling.
Well, and just as a practical political matter, though, if you want to advance policy in North Dakota, you're going to have to get Republicans on board. That's just a reality of it. I think it's interesting because I want to focus for a minute on what the city of Fargo, or I should say, Fargo City Commissioner Arlette Preston is proposing. And I like Mark, I haven't seen an actual draft of an ordinance, but I do have a description from Barry Amundsen writing here in the Fargo Forum. And she's not calling it hate crimes. She's using the term bias crimes. And Mr. Amundsen writes, bias crimes would be a secondary charge attached to other criminal offenses such as simple assault, harassment, criminal mischief, or discharge of a weapon. Violations would carry a fine of up to $1,500, 30 days in jail, or both, which is the highest penalty a city ordinance can impose under North Dakota law. Now, putting a pin for a minute in the debate over whether or not at the state level we should have, whether or not our existing policies are sufficient, whether or not we should make changes to them. I'm not sure that city ordinance is the appropriate way or the appropriate place to create this policy. And Wes, I'll put this to you, and I make that argument for two reasons. First, the cities are very limited in what they can do to begin with. They can't. $1,500 and 30 days in jail is the highest they can go anyway, and we're talking sometimes about some very serious crimes. They just can't do much. Second of all, there's the reality that cities like Fargo get to keep money that they fine. And when they fine somebody $1,500 under a city ordinance, the city of Fargo keeps that money. Now, that's distinct from state-level crime. So if a county deputy or a state highway patrol officer pulls you over for speeding, or you end up getting fined in some way in a state court for violating a state law, that money goes into the Common Schools Trust Fund. It doesn't go to the jurisdiction. So I think in Fargo, and really this is a much larger problem than this specific issue. I think when cities get involved in criminal statutes, we run into an issue with policing for profit. And I would be very scared if Fargo introduced this ordinance and now they have a financial incentive to go out and find hate crimes and make money. That's to me, I don't ever want the police to have a financial incentive to arrest people.
Come on, Rob. Like, when you're talking about hate crimes, you're talking about something that is such a small percentage in the amount of crimes that are actually committed. So this is, and then.
But if the city has a financial incentive, it might not stay such a small percentage.
I have a very hard time believing, and I think that is something that you should be very careful in accusing, of even a possibility that our law enforcement or our city would use such a weapon to, slap people with hate crime charges in order to profit. But
I'm surprised because I remember when I was reading the Department of Justice report after the protests in Ferguson, one of the things that the Department of Justice found was that the Ferguson Police Department, motivated by revenue reasons, was one of the big points of friction between the minority communities there and the police department was policing for profit, where they were jaywalking, and every little thing they could ding somebody on, they were dinging them on and writing them a fine and basically profiting off those communities. So I don't think it's that much of a stretch to think that some of these jurisdictions might be motivated by money. Mark, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry, Robert. It's in West. This isn't an accusation. This is the truth. This is what is happening. Fargo is using its police force and its municipal courts to gain profit. The cities in North Dakota are doing that. In conjunction with this proposal, if the city of Fargo would say, we want to enact our own hate crimes, but we want to deposit all fines and fees and forfeitures into the Common Schools Trust Fund so that police are not accused of picking and choosing victims or crimes based on profit, it would change the dynamic of this. But that is the stark reality. Cities are policing for profits. And by the way, trusting our government on this maybe isn't such a good idea. The government has a long history of perpetuating and encouraging bias. Look back in 1956, the Attorney General in Alabama used state and corporation laws to attempt to oust the NAACP from Alabama. They tried to convince the NAACP to turn over the names and addresses of their members at the same time. Louisiana tried to expel the NAACP by requiring registration of organizations. Virginia, for example, has used laws prohibiting solicitation by lawyers to prevent minorities from providing legal assistance to people accused of civil rights violations. Really, the stark reality of this, and nobody can dispute this, our minorities have had a very disparate treatment in our criminal justice system. We've had aggressive sentencing across the state. Across the states, one real stark example of this, if you do any reading, you'll see a crack cocaine disparity in federal sentencing guidelines. White citizens typically use cocaine in powdered form. Black citizens typically use it in crack form. Those that use crack were 100 times harsher sentences under the federal sentencing guidelines. But now what we're doing, and I think what we see with hate crimes, is we see this struggle between criminal justice reform and trying to protect minority populations. But the reality is, under the guise of protecting or attempting to protect vulnerable communities, we expand the system under which those communities have been subject to unjust treatment. So that's really the big problem that underlies this.
Sorry, go ahead, Wes.
Don't get me wrong. I absolutely know that the police and our government use their means in a for-profit way, as far as ticketing and violations of that area. And Mark, you bring up lots of examples of how the city has done a lot to undermine Black equality and so forth. But the issue at hand that we're talking about is actually charging, what would most likely end up being white folks with hate crimes in order to profit off of them. And I have a hard time seeing how that's going to actually play out. If the city of Fargo and the police department, start charging, white members of the community unjustly with hate crime charges in order for profit, the city and community would probably turn against them. When I sat down with the state's attorney office, as far as them even prosecuting, hate crime charges, they basically said that they would more likely use it as a bargaining chip to get the person to plead to the other charge that they most likely would be charged with. So you would need the city, you would need the police department, and you would need the state's prosecutor's office to all be in cahoots in order to make this all. So if the police department says they should charge this guy with a hate crime charge, is the prosecutor's office does not need to be on board in order to actually get it to go through?
Well, and let me back up and address a point before that. State's attorney's office is not involved in prosecutions under municipal ordinance. That's strictly a city function. So they're not involved. They don't have any input. If they want to try to create more crimes, to create leverage, to secure convictions against people. And don't believe for a minute, Wes, that if this is adopted, that it's simply going to be applied to white people. It's going to be applied to Black people as well. And that really begs the question, where do we draw the lines as to the protected class? Take, for example, Louisiana. They added police officers. In 2016, they added police officers and firefighters to their classifications of protected people under their hate crimes law. So if I commit disorderly conduct, or I use harsh language against some person, I'm prosecuted for a misdemeanor. But if I do it against a police officer, should it be a misdemeanor plus another misdemeanor simply because they're a police officer? And where do you start? Where do you stop drawing the lines? I really think the reality is people should be punished based on their behavior, the motives of that behavior within a sentencing range, and we should look at adding a factor to the sentencing statute in North Dakota to allow judges to look at the motivations and the biases and the bigotries that may have influenced the crime to increase the penalty. The answer should not be, let's create a new crime or an additional crime so that we can pressure somebody into pleading guilty and waiving their trial rights on some other crime.
Wes, I wanted to ask, have you done research? Because one thing that I'm really interested in is the one thing I think that we're all interested in is, is there a public policy that we could put in place to deter crimes motivated by racial animus or motivated by some sort of bigotry? If there's a way to do that while simultaneously protecting everybody's rights, I'm for that. And so I guess my question for you, Wes, is, have you looked into whether or not these policies, where they've been implemented in other parts of our country or other parts of the world, have they accomplished that? And one thing, because I think a lot of times we promote policies and because we think they ought to work, right? So for years people have promoted the death penalty, and I'm not for the death penalty, but people have promoted the death penalty on the idea that it deters particularly heinous sorts of crimes. For years people have promoted additional hardships for people convicted of child abuse crimes or sex crimes, where they have to register and at times I remember in our state legislature, at one point there was a lawmaker who wanted somebody who was on the sex offender list, they would have to turn over their social media passwords and email passwords to law enforcement so that they could be monitored. We do these sorts of things because we assume that they work, but then a lot of times when we find out in practice, they're not really stopping the crime. And if you're not deterring the crime, what's the point? So I guess that's my very long-winded way of asking you the question. Have you looked into, do these policies work elsewhere?
That's basically where we were able to collect our information and kind of put our pieces together as far as this current ordinance. Is we looked across the country to see the most successful ways that people were able to enact city ordinances that were towards biased crimes, and we put together our language basically based off of that. And yeah, again, Fargo has touched, North Dakota has touched as high as number 1 per capita, and there hasn't really been anything done to actually address the hate crime that occur in our state, and they're still happening just as early as a few weeks ago with the mosque. So clearly there is a problem. No one's really focused on doing anything about it, and so finally, we're trying our best to, find a solution. And it's sad that that's what it takes for us to have the conversation, and then the conversation is towards, well, no, this is not the best idea. Well, if you don't think it's the best idea, then why aren't you pushing forward other ideas and working on them? Because clearly someone being targeted because of the color of their skin, that's a problem.
Well, absolutely it is. Or their sexuality, or their gender, or their religion, or anything like that.
Yeah, because we've also had that in the city of Fargo with the Jesus statue as well. It's not okay.
Absolutely fair, Mark. Mark, that's a challenge for you. If not hate crime legislation, then what?
Well, as I indicated, I think that we need to change North Dakota state law to say that a judge should consider bigotry and bias as one of the factors in determining the appropriate sentence. Take, for example, a typical misdemeanor under Fargo ordinance, it's anywhere from 0 to 30 days in jail. If it's criminal mischief based on some dumb young kid spray painting somebody's car just for fun, versus spray painting somebody's car because of animus or bigotry, the judge should sentence harsher if it's motivated by the bigotry or animus toward another person rather than just being stupid, right? So again, Rob, to answer the question that you presented to Wes, I'll disagree with him. I don't believe that hate crimes reduce prejudice. In fact, I think the statistics bear out that hate crimes increase prejudice.
Why do you think that is, Mark? I guess I haven't looked at that data specifically. Why do you think that's the case?
2 reasons. Number 1, I don't think that an offender coming into court and pleading guilty to a hate crime because they're a pig and they're a bigot and they're somebody who's loathsome and we don't like. I don't think they come in and they get sentenced on a crime for bigotry and say, I spent 30 days in jail. I'm no longer a bigot. I think they feel even more upset. They feel even more taken advantage of. And offenders who are punished more harshly within groups. So you take a group of people in, pick it, the Ku Klux Klan or some organization that's founded in bigotry. Somebody in that group gets prosecuted for a hate crime. They gain prestige within the group. So as a result, it increases the notion of prejudice and increases the prejudice in whole. And that's one of just a multitude of examples of the paradoxical effects of hate crime laws. It also creates resentment of minorities. If the general public believes that certain classes of people, whether they're white people or black people or LGBT, whoever, make the classification however you want. If ordinary citizens say that person or that group is receiving preferential treatment, it's the same notion that you and I had when we were in grade school, where the student who was the teacher's pet was getting preferential treatment and they were disliked. So this creates more disdain and more dislike for people who are within whatever umbrella we set as protected people. And again, I mean, where do we draw the lines? Is it police officers? Is it people of color? Is it people of particular genders? All of a sudden, when you start drawing the lines and you cast the net completely wide, we're back to ground zero where it's all people.
Wes, I'm sorry, go ahead, Wes.
To your point, as a black man in America, let me tell you that I absolutely believe that white people do receive better protection and more protection under the law. And I would say that a majority of the marginalized community in this entire country believes the same. It does not put you in any greater harm whatsoever. So I don't think that that's a valid reasoning as to why we shouldn't create protections for people or have protected classes. I just don't. It's easy for you to say that, being that you are the majority, but considering the history of this country, when you talk about, I was just in Grand Forks last week and was just going over the story of Charles Thurber, a black man in Grand Forks who was lynched from the bridge, and he was dragged out of the courthouse, and they took his life. And the legal system did not play its part. They allowed that to happen. And then afterwards, the cherry on top was the fact that there wasn't even an investigation done into the people that actually lynched him. And so this country has not done a good job of protecting marginalized people in its history. And I do believe that at some point we have to be intentional in that protection. The escalator idea, it definitely sounds great. I would appreciate that, but it's still leaving it into the hands of the system, and to not really being intentional and making sure that we're driving home the point. Because we do need protections as marginalized people. There's a lot of hate going on.
Oh yeah, I wanted to ask you to respond to that specifically, Wes. Was Mark's idea of, instead of it being a separate crime, like you're convicted of assaulting somebody and then you're also charged with a separate crime that's a hate crime. I think Mark's point, what you understood, was that it would basically be an intensifier for sentencing. So when the judge says, well, why did you assault this person? Well, they did it because they're a bigot. Well, you're going to get a tougher sentence versus I did it because I was drunk, which is still not good by any stretch of the imagination or excusable, but maybe we could agree is a different sort of different characteristic on the crime. But you want to see a distinct charge, Wes, under the law.
Correct. Because under Mark's formula, it's going to come down to a thing of consideration. And we all know this country is predominantly white. In the state of North Dakota, we have predominantly white judges that are most likely, you can't guarantee that things are going to be done in the necessity, because the system tends to have leniency towards white folks compared to the way that they dish out punishment towards marginalized BIPOC community.
Well, that's maybe a challenge back to Mark then. Mark, you acknowledged earlier in our discussion that, for instance, I think you were referencing convictions for cocaine, where crack cocaine versus powder cocaine, white people were getting lighter sentences. I think that's a manifestation, right, of exactly what Wes is talking about.
one of many, and I 100% agree with you, Wes. I have represented people of color. I've been involved in criminal justice my entire adult life in one form or another, and now it's representing people who are accused of crimes. And what is the worst part of this proposal is we're turning to a system that has failed minorities to try to use that same system that we've been trying to correct the deficiency that existed before. And that's really the problem here. There are a lot of us that have worked very hard over the last 2 decades to reform and revise our criminal justice system to remove the disparities that have been created, like the crack cocaine disparity that we talked about, like jury bias and jury animus. And if you enact a law that says that juries are supposed to be looking into the heads of people as to whether they're bigoted or not, and it's a black person who's the defendant rather than the white person, and you've got a majority white jury and you've got a white judge, we now have a crime where the people we intend to protect under the crime are going to suffer from it. There are much better answers than creating new crimes. There are much better ways to address this. And again, I would be very reluctant to turn to the system that has so significantly marginalized our minority populations and has treated them so disparately that they can't be trusted to use this in the way that it would be intended to provide the relief. There are proof problems with these things as well, right? Normally, in criminal cases, motive is never an element. If somebody steals and they steal because they want to buy drugs, or somebody steals because they can't afford to feed their kids, it doesn't matter. If they've stolen, they've stolen. They violated the law. But when a judge sentences somebody for stealing and they see what the motive behind it is, they can punish more harshly or less harshly based on the motives of the person. And bias and bigotry is always a motive. It's not an element of the crime. To create it as an element of the crime creates proof problems, and it puts us into a system that we've seen can't be trusted to treat people fairly.
I want to incorporate some. And by the way, if you're watching this, you can go to one of our news sites, inforum.com, grandforksherald.com, jamestownssun.com, ticketsatpress.com. We have a chat room running, and I want to incorporate some of the comments people are posting in the chat room. Justin says, it seems whenever the legislature wants to skirt providing legal protection for North Dakota's LGBT community, the majority nitpicks the bill to avoid passing the law. Those voting against the law attempt to save face by making comments that begin with statements like, I support gay rights, but do you foresee this happening with hate crime legislation as well? And Wes, I think you actually already made that point earlier in the discussion.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, again, like the way things, watching what happened in Bismarck when the legislation was presented was probably one of the worst experiences of my life. Seeing our Republican lawmakers completely just make a joke, a mockery of the legislation was really tough to sit through, comparing it to making Polish jokes and Armenian jokes and things of that nature was just wrong. And it just showed where, we are at this time. There isn't much diversity within the leadership that is North Dakota. And so you don't have people who are really seeing it from, both sides of the coin. They're seeing it as something that's divisive. They're seeing it as something that is going to try and infringe on people's thoughts, when that isn't the case. Mark's right. It is something that's very hard to prove, but there are ways where there's clear cases of being able to prove that. I've received multiple death threats, because I've spoke out for racial equality, right? And should that person act out on such a crime and they're, driven by such hate, you're able to put those guidelines in place. You have people who are part of racist chat line groups. There's ways that shows who people are before they commit a crime and shows the intent behind them actually committing the crime. It's not something that's always going to be used, but just because it always isn't going to be used doesn't mean we shouldn't have it on the books. There's lots of laws that are on the books that are rarely used, but guess what? In certain instances where they might be used, they are there for a reason. And so I don't think that we should discount hate crime legislation because it won't be used all that time or it's hard to prove.
I want another commenter from the chat room going by ND says, every time quote unquote hate crime legislation comes up, It is used to muzzle conservative voices or criminalize disagreement. All crime is at some level hate crime. No one should be punished more or less. No victim is worth more or less. My religion gets a lot of hate. I'm Catholic, but somehow we never get covered by hate crime laws. Everyone is equal, so let the law deal with it objectively. There is no need for special hate laws or special treatment. The word hate is misused enough as it is. Now, Mark, I think there is something. I'm not sure I agree with everything in that comment, but I think there is a point, and I know as somebody who practices the First Amendment for a reason, for a living, and love the First Amendment. The reality is that being racist in America is not illegal, and nor should it be. As much as I detest bigotry and detest racism and think it's disgusting, we have the First Amendment, and we should have the First Amendment. And what does the First Amendment stand for if not to protect speech that most of us don't like? We don't need the First Amendment to protect us talking about baseball or talking about the weather. We need it the most when it so is there, as a practical matter, if we were to put in place a hate crime statute, would it put in place matters? For instance, let's say you have an individual and he gets into a fight with somebody who's a different race than they are outside of a bar, 2 o'clock in the morning, and they're both drunk, and he punches them in the face. And then during prosecution, it turns out that 10 years earlier, he used a racial slur. Does that make the crime he committed 10 years later a hate crime? How does that work?
And that's exactly the proof problems that come into these cases. And the states that are striking down these hate laws are doing it on that basis, where people are being prosecuted for their bigoted statements unrelated to the crime or their bigoted beliefs. And you know, there's a lot of people that would maybe shrug their shoulders and say, so what? I mean, a bigoted person should be treated in that manner. We shouldn't have much sympathy for them. But the Constitution, which is the supreme law of the land, stands for the proposition that if you want to be a bigot and you want to espouse bigoted statements, you're permitted to do so, as abhorrent as that is and as distasteful as that is for most of us. And let's use the Wisconsin versus Mitchell case. I mean, that's the pinnacle case in the United States about the constitutionality of hate crime laws, that they are constitutional. And what had happened is a group of people got together. They were discussing a movie. It was a pretty big movie back then in the 1980s called Mississippi Burning. So this group of young men were talking about Mississippi Burning. It was a movie talking about the KKK's targeting of people, black people who were civil rights activists. After discussing that movie, the group of young men had gone outside, and there was a young boy walking on the street, and they went over to him. One of the group said, "Go get him," and they went and grabbed this kid. They beat him unconscious. He was in a coma for 4 days. They stole his shoes, and they were prosecuted for hate crimes laws. And hate crime violations. And their sentence was enhanced because there was a connection between what they were saying and the bad act that they did. Well, it turns out most people would expect that Mr. Mitchell would be, a white person, but in fact he wasn't. It was a black person, a young black man who was upset and agitated about this movie and the discussion of the movie, and they targeted a young kid based on probably just being immature and stupid rather than having hatred and bigotry in their hearts. But that's really the problem with these cases, is we're prosecuting people for holding beliefs, and these things get turned around and used against the people that they were intended to protect. Because I have no doubt that the state of Wisconsin enacted their hate crimes law to protect minority populations rather than to be used against minority populations who are striking back because of social injustices or what they perceive were social injustices over the course of centuries.
I think to bring that up, like, in a sense, I don't think that it's right. You know what I mean? If a black person commits a hate crime, to say that they shouldn't be charged even more harsher, like, is that what you're trying to say? Because to me, when we were creating this, there needs to be a level of fairness. I don't think that, if a white person targets a person of color, and to say that they should be charged, and if a black person targets a white person simply for the color of their skin, they shouldn't be. I don't.
Well, I think we all agree that I mean, most serial killers are men, but we all agree that if a woman commits serial murders, then that woman should be held accountable under the law the same as a man would be. I think, Mark, I think we all agree on that, right?
Well, I do. And I think that we punish people based on their behavior within the existing law rather than creating additional laws which could be flipped around and used against the people that we're trying to protect. But, it's just as deplorable to me for a black defendant to target a white person based on bigotry as it is for a white person to target a black person based on bigotry. But adding new laws and turning to the system that has proven itself incapable of treating minorities fairly is the wrong answer in my view.
Well, that's a question that Matt has in the chat room. He says, doesn't leaving motive, and Mark, this was your argument that we want to move this into sentencing. Matt asks, doesn't leaving motive as a consideration in sentencing open marginalized defendants up to more harm in the face of evidence as to motive? Additionally, it's apparent to me that judges are just as involved in the disparate impact of and treatment of marginalized communities as the rest of the system. How do we trust judges more to fairly evaluate motive than we do anyone else who is a part of the system?
And it's great questions, because Mark is saying we can't leave it up to the system as far as the hate crime laws or legislation to, exact that properly. But then at the same time, trusting that same system to, without any real firm guidelines, consider escalation of charges and, having that gray area and consideration of charges as well when it comes to, hate crime or acts of hate, basically. And so I still don't think we have anything other than the ordinance or legislation that we truly have another step outside of it yet. That's pretty clear in this conversation.
Mark, address Matt's question for me.
Yeah, well, it's a good one. I agree with Wes, and I agree. Where in the system do you plug it in, right? Under a proposal to create a new crime, we're going to put motive in the hands of a jury rather than in the hands of a judge for sentencing. The United States Supreme Court has long held that a racist person's beliefs can be considered if it was used to determine the sentence. This goes all the way back to 1983. A defendant's racial animosity toward a victim may be considered when determining whether to sentence the defendant to death for a particular crime. But their racist beliefs cannot be considered if they were unrelated to the crime. Judges know the distinction between factors that can be considered and those that can't. Judges take an oath. They promise that they're going to apply the law equally. My view is I think we're in a much better position letting a judge at sentencing address that motive than trying to put motive into the hands of a jury in a secret deliberation room that's not done in open court. So there is, Wes, you're right. I'm not disputing that. There are problems with our existing system. There are questions where we would plug it into the system, but creating a new crime, to me, in light of what we've experienced, is not the right thing to do.
Well, I think there also comes a point where if the people in charge of applying the law are going to do so in a racist or bigoted manner, the problem is not the law. The problem may be the people. So if you have a judge who is sentencing people and the sentences are disparate based on something like race or maybe gender or sexual orientation or whatever characteristic we're talking about, then the problem is that judge. And in North Dakota, our judges are elected. District court judges are elected. Those races aren't, unfortunately, very often very competitive. But the mechanism is there to not only elect them, but I believe they can be recalled. I believe they're even subject to the state recall. Maybe Mark could correct me on that. But
well, they are, and there's a judicial conduct commission too. So if there's evidence of bias, our judges do training all of the time. We have commissions appointed by the Supreme Court to address bias as it relates to the judiciary. I think our judiciary. I talked earlier about the last couple of decades where people have come together to try to reform our criminal justice system to make it more fair. Our judiciary has done a very good job of trying to address that. But Wes is right. I mean, and it's more than just a history of disparate treatment, it goes from the beginning, right? Most oppressed people, most racial minorities, they go into court charged with a crime. They can't afford zealous representation. They have to rely on a public defense system that is sometimes overwhelmed. They go in before a white judge with a white prosecutor and a white jury in a system, and they expect to be treated fairly. Now we create a hate crime where they go in under those same circumstances, and it's a black person charged with hatred toward a white person, and they're a minority in a system that's filled with minorities. We've created a worse monster than we've tried to prevent.
Wes, your thoughts?
Yeah, I just think that that's one example that's probably going to be like a unicorn of a situation that's most likely to happen. And I think that with something like that happening, the amount of visibility that would be involved in a situation like that would be extremely high. Considering the racial makeup of what is North Dakota. And so, that would also be comparable to other cases. And if there was disparate treatment there, it would be really visible on a grand scale. So, my belief is that if something like that were to happen, the entire state would have their eyes on that case. And we would also have people that would be looking to make sure that, punishment would be equal to, what the standard trend was. But again, going back to the fact that we've had a discrimination law on the books that from the search that the state's attorney office did, they were not able to reveal a single plausible case. That is the word that came directly from them that was given to me. And so, yeah, like I said, we still got a long way to go regardless.
That was one thing. I wrote a column about back in, when did I write this? Back in March, I think. Or maybe before that, maybe it was February. But it was around the time when it was making news that Arlette Preston was going to be pushing her ordinance related to bias crime. And one of the things that Cass County State's Attorney Birch Burdick, the point that he made, quoted in the article about it, was actual assaults are easier to prove in court than the intent behind an assault. And then there's another quote I pulled out. It was from it was a ProPublica investigation about hate crime policies nationally. The headline was, "Hate crime law results in few convictions and lots of disappointment." And in both instances, the argument, what prosecutors are saying is, okay, we have these statutes on, but they are very, very difficult to get a conviction on. And when you bring them in court, if you're a prosecutor and you're going up against a defense attorney like Mark, and you're bringing charges that are tough, you're in front of a jury and you're putting multiple charges in front of a jury. And if a defense attorney can create reasonable doubt on one charge, that could put your other charges at risk in front of a jury. So Wes, my question to you is, could it be that the statute that's on North Dakota's books, could the reason why it's not being used very often is that prosecutors really struggle to be able to prove to prove the charge in court?
I wish I could say that was the case, but the fact of the matter is that the state's attorney's office didn't even know it was on the books, for up until a few months ago. And I agree, it is something that is very hard to prove, but there are, and in that case, you go with the other charge. You don't want to just charge someone with something that you don't believe you can prove, because that's something that's kind of already being practiced against the marginalized community. You load them up with a ton of charges, they're facing a ton of jail time, and then you go ahead and get them to plead down to a reduced sentence or a reduced charge. And that
can we agree that's not a good practice, though? I mean, I don't like that, Mark. I know it happens all the time, but I'm not happy that that's happening at all. That shouldn't happen.
I would look at the flip side of this too, Wes. If we've had a law in the book since 1973 that has allowed prosecutors to prosecute the types of things that Fargo wants to try to criminalize with a new ordinance or its own ordinance, shouldn't that beg the question, why, as Rob has asked, and should this law stay in the books? If it's not enforceable, if it's not good policy, for years since the inception of North Dakota, at the time when North Dakota was a territory, all the way up till about 10, 12 years ago, North Dakota had a cohabitation law in the books. It was a crime to openly and notoriously live with somebody of the opposite gender as if you were married when you were not. No prosecutors would prosecute it. That law.
I violated that crime.
It's terrible. It's terrible policy, right? So instead of addressing the law on the books, prosecutors ignored it. I think that we start here in this debate, and this discussion needs to start with a sit down with the State's Attorneys Association, with the prosecutors who are charged with the responsibility of enforcing the law, with examples of cases that should have been prosecuted under that statute, and with educating prosecutors to use the laws on the books. Every time we have worked forever, for the last 20 years at least, to try to reduce the number of crimes, and overcriminalization has had the most profound impact on people of color and minorities. So now, despite those efforts, we want to pile on by adding more crimes. It just really underscores the tension between meaningful criminal justice reform and fair treatment under the law. So I see this just on the opposite side of you, Wes. I think if this law's been there since 1973 and it's not being enforced, we need to start with education rather than creating new crimes.
I want to incorporate a comment from the chat room. Someone going by the name Moorhead resident writes, the suspect that vandalized the mosque, referring to the mosque incident from not that long ago, harassed other immigrant residents in our neighborhood long before this happened. I could see the value of hate crime laws to apply more accountability because the crime committed is more than the crime itself, but rather also a form of terrorism to make the marginalized community feel more fearful and embarrassed. When you are not a marginalized community, you don't really feel the threat. But when you are, you tend to self-censor. Hate crime laws bring feelings of relief that the ruling government has your back and wants to be fair and credible to all communities. Wes, I see you nodding, so I think you agree with that. So I'll go to Mark. You know, that argument, is there value in having a law on the books just to make our friends and neighbors in marginalized communities feel safer?
And it's not just the comment wasn't just, but it's something that they're also adding.
No, we were scared of drug users who used crack cocaine, but we weren't scared of drug users who used powdered cocaine. So Congress, in conjunction with a commission of judges and lawyers and prosecutors, enacted sentencing guidelines on the federal level where we had 100-fold punishments for people who were using crack cocaine rather than powdered cocaine. And it made people feel comfortable that crack addicts aren't going to be breaking into our cars and our houses. And we over-criminalized and we created harsher penalties for essentially the same conduct. So people who are thinking that they're going to be protected by the enactment of the law should look back to what Wes said. We've had a law in the book since 1973 that has prohibited it, but it's not being enforced. Do you feel better because of that? I don't think so.
And that's because the law was once again passed in a very performative nature. And the truth is, nobody knew this law existed, so no one knew that they were actually could be protected by a certain law. And when it comes to crack versus cocaine, it wasn't a thing of fear. It was a thing of prejudice. It was done in a way to criminalize the marginalized community. Since the end of slavery, that's pretty much what this system has pushed, is the over-criminalization of people of color and putting us into prisons. And when you look at it, like the stops by demographics data, white folks are just as likely to have drugs on them in their cars as black people will. But you're going to have black people that are going to be stopped and searched a majority of the time compared to whites not being done the same. And so to me, again, I think that, yes, it has an enforcement aspect. I don't want it to be performative, but at the same time, as us having this on the books, it does send a message that we are going to be, we're going to persecute or prosecute people who commit hateful acts and target people specifically on a protected class. We're going to hold them accountable in every sense of the word. And I don't think leaving that in the hands of a judge, it really does that. I just don't.
I think all of us in this. Sorry, I'll let you speak here in a moment, Mark. I think all of us during this discussion have made the point that the system has problems, that it produces outcomes, and a lot of times that has to do. I think Mark's point about cocaine is the reason why the majority or what have you was not afraid of powdered cocaine, but was afraid of crack cocaine, was the skin color of the people using each form of that drug. And so I think we're all acknowledging that the system can have racism and bias built into it. But if you're setting out to solve that problem, Wes, how does inputting another law into a flawed system fix anything? It seems like if that's the problem, then the problem that needs to be fixed is we need a better sort of law enforcement mechanism and a better sort of criminal better cops, better prosecutors, better judges to not produce those outcomes.
When you have the law in the book, just like we were able to do with the current law in the book, we were able to look back and say, well, how many people were actually, we have, hate crime data, and then we can look and see how many people were prosecuted, according to that data. And that tells a clear story, right? Well, if you have just an escalation of charges, which is at the judge's discretion, how do you track that to show that, we're truly enforcing this to stop, hate crimes from happening? How do we track that? How do we show it? And the truth is, it would be a very, very extremely complex process. And so by creating a hate crime law or a hate crime ordinance, we're kind of, in a sense, putting a little bit of power into the hands of the people, in a sense, and allowing it to be easier identified as to how we're actually combating hate.
Mark, I cut you off. You were trying to make a point.
Yeah, and I've got three of them now instead of two. Number one, Wes, keep going back to this issue that the prosecutors didn't know about the law. Shame on them, because you and I cannot claim ignorance of the law as a defense. In fact, there's a longstanding axiom of law that says ignorance of the law is no defense. So that's really, that's on them, and shame on them for not knowing the law. Because when this came up, I knew of that law, and I pointed it out to the prosecutors that were involved in some of these discussions as well. Secondly, statistics show that 20% of hate crimes are perpetrated by Black people against Caucasians. So if we create an additional law, the system that has not been fair to your minority community is going to be entrusted with trying to treat Black people charged with the same type of thing as fairly as they would with white people. So that, I think, is dangerous. And then third, this issue that just came up, evidence-based analysis of this, Rob, shows that even though somebody may be comfortable have more comfort because there's a law enacted that's supposed to protect them, enactment of hate crime statutes actually has very little direct effect on hate. And I pulled up a quote from a commentator who said, enacting a largely ineffective ethnic intimidation statute allows us to feel that we've taken steps to eliminate or reduce bigotry that somehow causes us to feel more important. But the enactment of the law ultimately slows the process of completing bigotry and results in, like North Dakota, where we've had laws on the books since 1973 that haven't been enforced, it furthers the bigotry rather than addressing it.
Wes, we just have just a couple minutes left, but last thoughts to you.
Yeah, and again, to me, like, you keep bringing up the point of, it's going to prosecute Black people. But the truth is, if a person of color assaults or does something violent towards a white person, you better believe the system's going to go ahead and super hold them accountable regardless. And so, prosecuting them with a hate crime charge or anything else, it's going to be a pretty stiff punishment regardless. And to me, it's not just about enacting the hate crime ordinance. This is about addressing hate overall, and it's not the only way. It shouldn't be the only way. Systemic reform is the entire platform that I am fighting for, and so many others are as well. So we're not just looking at this as a savior and grace. We truly do want to see our entire system get reformed to where there is really equality within our justice system and in our workforce and in all different levels of this country as well, because an oppressive America is not good for anybody anymore, and we truly need change.
No part of this debate is the silver bullet that's going to fix everything, to Wes's point.
True.
But I appreciate all of you, both of you gentlemen being on. I think we had a good discussion. Hopefully it was illuminating for the people watching. And, at the end of the day, I think whatever policy we put in place ultimately has to work. It can't be about making people feel good or whatever. At the end of the day, it has to accomplish the goal that it's set out to accomplish. I'm not sure that I'm persuaded that this sort of policy works, but I think it's a debate worth having. Wes, thank you for your time. Mark, thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Thanks for the invitation. Nice meeting you, Wes.
You as well, Mark. Thank you, Rob.